His wife said, "My ex will be the godfather of our baby, and he'll be named after him." What he did next shocked everyone. "Honey, there's something I've been thinking about. I want my ex to be the godfather of our baby, and I'd like our son to be named after him. He was my first love, you know, and keeping his name feels like holding on to a beautiful memory. Please don't say no. It won't change us. It's just a promise I made long ago." Those were the gentle but poisonous words Clara Parker whispered to her husband, smiling with quiet pride as though she had carved her ex into their bloodline forever. She had no idea those words would set in motion the most humiliating and unforgettable moment of her life. What happened next will make you question everything you think you know about love, marriage, and betrayal. Viewers, if your spouse asked you to name your child after their ex, how would you react? Tell us in the comments. The evening light fell gently through the curtains of the Parker home, painting warm golden streaks across the dining room. Brandon Parker had just returned from work, loosened his tie, and sat across from his wife. Clara Parker, heavily pregnant and glowing with a mix of pride and self-assurance, leaned back in her chair with her hands folded neatly on her stomach. She had the posture of someone about to deliver a verdict, not begin a conversation. Brandon reached for the jug of water on the table, pouring himself a glass, unaware that the sentence about to leave her lips would alter the direction of his entire marriage. Clara's eyes were sharp, her chin lifted slightly, and her tone rang with authority when she finally spoke. "Brandon," she began, "I've been thinking about our baby lately." Brandon looked up with the faintest of smiles. He expected talk of nursery colors or baby names they had tossed around late at night. Instead, her next word struck him like a blade. "I want Adrian to be the godfather of our child," she said firmly, "and the baby will bear his name." For a moment, silence hung in the room like smoke after a fire. Brandon's hand froze on the glass. His mind replayed the name, Adrian Blake, the ex, the man she had once loved before him, the man he had assumed was part of a closed chapter. Clara's words reopened it like a fresh wound. He swallowed hard, his voice calm but heavy. "You mean Adrian Blake?" Clara tilted her head, unfazed by his disbelief. "Yes, Adrian. He was my first love, my true beginning. It's only right that he remains part of my life. Our son should carry a name that reflects where I came from. Adrian will be both godfather and namesake. Please don't say no." Brandon's chest tightened as though the air had been drained from the room. Every instinct told him to lash out, to demand answers, to shout at the audacity of such a statement. But years of discipline and control forced him into stillness. His jaw tightened, his fists curled invisibly beneath the tablecloth, and his breath slowed into silence. Clara misinterpreted his quiet for weakness. Her lips curled slightly, almost in a smirk, as if daring him to oppose her. She believed she was in control, and her pregnancy gave her leverage. To her, this was not a discussion, but a proclamation. Brandon finally lifted his eyes from the glass of water to meet hers. "And what about me?" he asked evenly, his voice betraying none of the storm inside. "You're here, aren't you?" she replied quickly. "You'll always be here. But Adrian has a place in my heart that will never fade. This baby, he should carry that history." The knife twisted deeper. She hadn't just chosen another man's name. She had chosen another man's legacy. Brandon's bloodline, his father's honor, his family's name, all dismissed with the flick of Clara's words. Still, he didn't flinch. He nodded once, slowly, as if absorbing her declaration. He knew one thing. Explosive anger would only give her more power, and he refused to lose control. Dinner ended in silence. Clara leaned back, satisfied she had spoken her truth. She saw no reason to argue further. Brandon, however, was no longer thinking about dinner or conversation. His mind was calculating, silently rewriting the future he thought he had secured. That night, after Clara had gone to bed, Brandon stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her sleep. Her face was peaceful, almost angelic in the dim light. but the words she had spoken hours earlier still rang in his ears. Adrian will be the godfather. The baby will bear his name. He turned toward the window, staring out into the dark expanse of the city. Inside his chest, something hardened. It wasn't rage, it was resolve. In that instant, Brandon made a silent vow. If Clara wanted Adrian Blake etched into the fabric of their child's future, if she dared to drag her ex back into their lives, then she had underestimated the man she married. The city lights flickered outside as Brandon Parker lay awake, his back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling. Clara's steady breathing filled the room beside him. To anyone else, she looked like the image of peace, an expectant mother resting before the storm of childbirth. But for Brandon, every breath she took was laced with betrayal. Her words from earlier still pulsed in his ears. Adrian will be the godfather. The baby will bear his name. He replayed them again and again, and with every repetition, the sting sharpened into something colder, more calculating. At dawn, Brandon slid quietly out of bed, careful not to disturb her. He showered, dressed, and left the house without a sound. His car purred down the quiet streets until he parked outside a small coffee shop on the corner of Main and 3rd. Inside, tucked into a booth near the back, sat Logan Pierce. Logan was sharp-eyed, the kind of man who noticed everything but spoke little. A former cop turned private investigator, he had been Brandon's college friend, and in times of quiet trust, Brandon had always admired Logan's talent for seeing beneath the surface. Today, that talent would be tested. Brandon slid into the booth, his tone steady, but his eyes steel. I need answers, Logan. I need to know the truth about Clara and Adrian Blake. Logan raised a brow. You think something's going on? I don't think. Brandon replied quietly. I know. I just need proof. Pictures, videos, something no one can deny. Logan didn't press further. He simply nodded, took a sip of his coffee, and scribbled notes in a small pad. Give me a week. If there's something to find, I'll find it. Brandon leaned back, exhaling slowly. Discretion is everything. She can't suspect a thing. Logan smirked faintly. You know me. And with that, the deal was sealed. For the next several days, Brandon lived 2 lives. At home, he was the perfect husband. He cooked Clara's favorite meals, massaged her swollen feet, drove her to doctor's appointments, and played the doting father-to-be. To her, it seemed as though nothing had changed. At night, when Clara rested her head on his chest and whispered about the baby's future, Brandon stroked her hair gently, nodding in agreement, hiding the storm raging inside. He let her believe she had the upper hand, let her smirk at the thought of Adrian Blake's shadow looming over his family. But Brandon knew something she didn't. He had already mapped the battlefield, and she was walking straight into his trap. 1 week later, Logan slid into the same booth at the coffee shop. His laptop sat between them. It's done, he said. Everything you asked for, photos, videos, dates, times, enough to shut down any denial she could ever try to muster. Brandon leaned forward, his jaw clenched as the images flickered on the screen. Clara, laughing in Adrian's arms. Clara, sneaking into hotel lobbies. Clara, betraying her vows without shame. It was enough. More than enough. Brandon closed the laptop gently, his voice low. Thank you, Logan. You've done your part. Now it's my turn. Logan studied his friend's face. What are you going to do? Brandon's lips curved in the faintest of smiles, but his eyes were cold. Wait. She thinks she's clever. She thinks she has control. I'll let her believe that. Then I'll take it all back, at the right moment, in front of everyone. Days later, with Clara's due date approaching, Brandon kissed her cheek tenderly and announced he needed to travel for business. Clara didn't question it. In her mind, he was distracted, overworked, too preoccupied to notice the cracks she thought she had hidden. She watched him leave with a smug glow in her eyes. She had Adrian, she had her plan, and soon she would have a child named after the man she truly adored. Brandon closed the door behind him, his suitcase in hand. But the real baggage he carried was the evidence. Photographs, videos, and a growing resolve that would soon transform her arrogance into ruin. 3 days after he traveled, the contractions came in waves, tearing through Clara Parker's body with merciless rhythm. Her breaths grew shallow, her hands clutching the rail of the hospital bed as the nurses adjusted monitors and readied instruments. Sweat clung to her temples, but her voice was clear when she asked for her phone. "Not my husband," she whispered through gritted teeth. "Call Adrian Blake." Within an hour, Adrian strode into the maternity ward, his presence filling the sterile room with an arrogance that only emboldened Clara. He slipped his hand into hers, anchoring her through the agony. His tie was loose, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, but his eyes glowed with something darker than concern. Victory. "You're not alone," he murmured, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I'm here. I'll always be here." The nurses, trained to remain professional, exchanged quick glances but said nothing. When the cry of the newborn finally echoed through the air, Clara collapsed back against the pillows, her chest heaving with exhaustion. The nurse lifted the baby boy, swaddled in a white blanket, and asked the question every mother anticipates. "What will his name be?" Clara turned to Adrian. She smiled, lips curved with triumph, and spoke firmly. "Adrian. His name is Adrian Blake Parker." The words hung like a declaration. The nurse nodded, writing it down before handing over the birth certificate. Clara signed her name, her hand steady, her face radiant with pride. Adrian leaned over and kissed her temple, whispering, "You've given me a son." 2 days later, Clara was discharged. Neighbors dropped off casseroles, relatives gathered to coo over the infant, and Adrian visited daily with flowers and gifts. Clara paraded him as Godfather, her voice dripping with satisfaction whenever she introduced him. Some whispered, unsettled by the dynamic, but Clara silenced every doubt with her boldness. By the 5th day, Brandon Parker returned. The house smelled of baby powder and lilies, the soft coo of the child filling the living room. Clara sat on the couch, cradling the baby, when the front door opened. Brandon stepped in, carrying a bouquet of lilies and a silver rattle. His suit was crisp, his stride calm, his expression unreadable. Clara's heart skipped before she forced a smile. "You're back." He bent down, kissed her cheek gently, and looked at the baby in her arms. "I wouldn't miss this moment," he said softly. Clara adjusted the baby, her chin lifting. "Adrian was here. He helped. He signed as Godfather. You weren't around." Brandon's gaze lingered on her for a beat, then dropped to the child. He extended his arms, and Clara hesitated before allowing him to take the baby. He cradled the boy with a tenderness that made her chest tighten with unease. "What matters," he murmured, "is that you're safe. Both of you." The simplicity of his words unsettled her more than anger ever could. She was surprised. She expected rage, questions, maybe a confrontation. Instead, he was composed, almost serene. She convinced herself it was ignorance. To her, Brandon was too occupied with business, too blind to see what she had orchestrated. That night, after the guests had left and Clara drifted into sleep, Brandon stood in the nursery. Moonlight spilled through the blinds, casting pale lines across the crib. He gazed down at the infant, the name already etched into paper, the betrayal already sealed in ink. His hand moved with precision as he withdrew a sterile swab from his pocket. Quietly, carefully, he brushed it along the baby's inner cheek, slipping it into a vial and sealing it in an envelope. He placed it inside his briefcase, every motion deliberate, every detail rehearsed. The child stirred faintly, then settled back into slumber. Brandon stood a long while, his expression carved in stone. The evidence was his now. In a few days, truth would arrive in a thin white envelope, clinical but devastating. He glanced toward the bedroom where Clara slept, smug in her deception, certain of her triumph. His jaw tightened. She thought she had secured Adrian's place in their lives. She thought she had erased his name with the stroke of a pen, but Brandon Parker had already begun writing the ending. Morning light spilled across the Parker home, illuminating the quiet order Brandon had cultivated in his absence. Clara slept soundly in the bedroom, her breathing heavy with exhaustion, the baby's soft cries from the crib lulling back into silence. Brandon moved through the house like a man with a singular mission. The swabbed sample lay sealed in its sterile envelope, tucked inside his briefcase. He adjusted his tie, picked up his keys, and left the house before either Clara or the infant stirred. Downtown, the streets were just waking up. Commuters crowded sidewalks, coffee shops hummed, and Brandon's black sedan slid easily into a parking garage. He stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete as he crossed into the unmarked entrance of a private genetics laboratory. The receptionist looked up, her smile polite, her voice low. "Mr. Parker?" "Yes," Brandon said evenly, sliding the envelope across the counter. Her hands closed around it delicately, like it was more than paper and swabs. It was truth waiting to be unveiled. "We'll prioritize this," she promised. 3 business days. You'll hear from us directly." Brandon's nod was curt. "Thank you." He left without another word, his pace steady, his face unreadable. For the next 3 days, Brandon carried himself as though nothing had shifted. At home, he wore the mask flawlessly. He washed bottles, held the baby, sat with Clara as she watched television, even offered to take midnight shifts so she could rest. To the neighbors, he was the image of a supportive husband. To Clara, he seemed distracted but loyal, the same man who had always provided quietly. But beneath the calm surface, Brandon's thoughts churned like an undercurrent. Each moment with the baby carried a sting of doubt. Each time Clara smiled smugly, tightened the knot in his chest. He had seen the photographs Logan Pierce had collected, the videos that confirmed her betrayal, but nothing cut deeper than waiting for the numbers that would declare whether this child was his blood or another man's legacy. On the 3rd morning, his phone buzzed with a discreet notification. A delivery had arrived at his office. He drove there in silence, the city blurring past his windows. In the stillness of his private study, he slit the envelope open with surgical care. The report was thin, clinical. His eyes scanned the page, finding the conclusion in bold type. Probability of paternity, 0%. Brandon's hand tightened around the paper, his knuckles whitening. The words weren't a surprise. They were confirmation of what he had already suspected, what Logan's evidence had all but proved. Yet seeing it written in black and white stripped away the last fragments of denial. The baby Clara cradled so proudly was not his. He sat there for a long while, staring at the document. The office was silent except for the ticking of a wall clock, each second landing heavy as stone. Rage didn't rise in him. There was no outburst, no curse, no shattered glass. What came instead was cold clarity. Brandon folded the report neatly, sliding it into a leather folder already heavy with Logan's photographs and videos. He opened the desk drawer and placed it inside, locking it with a metallic click. He exhaled once, slow and deliberate, as though sealing away the last thread of hesitation with it. That evening, he returned home carrying takeout from Clara's favorite restaurant. She greeted him with a smug smile, her eyes flicking toward the baby as if to remind him of the name she had claimed. Brandon kissed her cheek, handed her the food, and cradled the boy in his arms. His touch was gentle, his voice soft, but his eyes were hard. The DNA test lay locked in Brandon Parker's study, its verdict clear, its weight heavy. The photographs and videos Logan Pierce had gathered were stacked neatly beside it. Evidence was no longer a whisper. It was now a blade sharpened for use. But Brandon was not rushing. He wanted every step to be meticulous. 2 mornings later, Brandon drove downtown to Whitman Cole Attorneys at Law. The glass facade of the building reflected the sun like steel, and when he stepped inside, The air smelled of polished wood and precision. He had already made up his mind. In the conference room, Raymond Whitman adjusted his glasses as Brandon placed the folder on the table. Logan's photographs, the videos, and the DNA report spread across the polished surface like pieces of a puzzle. Whitman examined them in silence, his expression tightening with each page. "You've come prepared," Whitman finally said. "I want this marriage ended," Brandon replied. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Adultery, deception, and a child that is not mine. I'm filing for divorce." Whitman tapped the DNA result with his pen. "This alone is enough to cut any question. With the photos and video, you have irrefutable grounds. Custody won't concern you. The court will recognize the child isn't yours." Brandon's jaw hardened. "Good. Draft everything. I'll sign what you need today." Whitman nodded. "It will take a few days to prepare the full petition. My office will ensure it's airtight. By next week, you'll have certified copies ready to serve her." Brandon leaned forward, signing the retainer agreement and initial filing papers with steady strokes of his pen. When he stood, he adjusted his cufflinks, his composure unshaken. "Make it clean. No room for challenge." "You'll have it," Whitman assured him. When Brandon stepped back into the morning sunlight, he felt no relief, only focus. The countdown had begun, and Clara Parker didn't know she was already living on borrowed time. Back home, Clara was in a whirlwind of energy. The christening was only 2 weeks away, and she treated it like a royal coronation. Guests had been invited, catering arranged, the church hall secured. Boxes of white lilies arrived at the door, and little Adrian's christening cloth hung pressed and ready. Clara floated through the house with satisfaction etched on her face. Every call she made, every arrangement she confirmed, was another layer of her victory. Adrian Blake visited often, striding in with smugness, practicing the role he would soon display to the world. Clara didn't bother to hide her pride anymore. She flaunted it, testing Brandon's silence with every mention of Adrian's name. One evening, as she folded the christening clothes, Clara said with a smile that barely disguised her glee, "Adrian's family confirmed. They'll be there. Everyone important will be there. Our child will be blessed with his name and his presence." Brandon, seated across the room, looked up from the ledger he had been pretending to read. His face was composed, his tone even. "It will be a day to remember." She mistook his calm for surrender. She believed she had won. In truth, Brandon had already arranged for the projector and screen under the guise of a family slideshow. He had checked the sound system himself, ensuring it would be flawless. He had prepared the presentation, photographs, videos, the undeniable proof of her betrayal, and tucked safely in his study drawer, waiting for collection in a few days, would be the final weapon. Divorce papers filed, sealed with his signature. On the night before the baptism, Brandon stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching the child sleep. Moonlight spilled across the crib, highlighting the small, peaceful face of a boy who carried another man's blood. The morning of the baptism dawned bright, the kind of clear Sunday light that seemed to promise joy. St. Andrew's Church glistened in the sun, its tall stained glass windows casting jewel tones across the stone steps where guests gathered in polished suits and pressed dresses. The air was rich with laughter, the clink of heels, the rustle of fine fabric. Inside, the sanctuary had been dressed with lilies and white ribbons. Clara Parker stood at the front in an ivory dress, her makeup flawless, her smile radiant. She held the baby in her arms as though she were presenting royalty. Beside her, Adrian Blake adjusted his suit jacket, his expression smug. He greeted guests with the confident nod of a man stepping into a role he had long coveted. Brandon Parker stood a few paces away, impeccably dressed in a black tailored suit. His face was composed, his presence steady, his hands clasped loosely before him. To the casual observer, he looked like any proud husband and father, quietly watching his wife and child take center stage. But beneath the calm exterior, Brandon was prepared for war. the pews filled with family, friends, neighbors, and Adrian's own relatives. Clara glowed brighter with each arrival, every congratulatory whisper feeding her arrogance. She believed she had done it. She had rewritten her life, elevated her ex-lover into her family's legacy, and diminished her husband into a silent bystander. When the pastor cleared his throat and called the gathering to order, the ceremony began. Hymns filled the air, prayers were read, and the baby's forehead was gently touched with water. Clara lifted her chin with pride, her eyes flicking toward Adrian, as though to say, "This is our triumph." Then the pastor turned to Brandon. "Mr. Parker, would you like to say a few words?" The sanctuary hushed. All eyes turned to him. Brandon stepped forward with measured calm, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. He stood before the congregation, his voice even, steady, but carrying a weight that made the pews lean in. "Before we continue," he said, "I think there are some things everyone here should see." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Clara stiffened, her smile faltering, confusion flashing in her eyes. Adrian frowned, shifting uncomfortably. Brandon raised a hand, signaling to the church technician. At once, the screen behind the altar flickered to life. The first image appeared, Clara and Adrian, their hands intertwined across a cafe table, faces close in laughter. The room went utterly still. The next slide showed them stepping into a hotel lobby, glancing around before disappearing into the elevator. Then came the video, grainy but undeniable. Clara kissing Adrian passionately in a dim hallway, his arms wrapped around her waist. Gasps filled the sanctuary. Some guests covered their mouths, others turned their faces away. Clara's skin drained of color, her lips parted in shock. Adrian's posture stiffened, his jaw clenching as whispers swelled louder and louder. Brandon let the images run, each one striking like a hammer. He didn't speak, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, his silence more cutting than any shout. When the final photograph faded from the screen, the sanctuary was heavy with disbelief. The pastor's face was pale, his Bible trembling in his hands. Clara stumbled forward, her voice breaking. "Brandon, what are you doing? Stop this!" But the damage was already done. Brandon turned slowly, his eyes sweeping the crowd before settling on Clara. His expression was calm, his voice low but sharp as glass. "You thought this day would be your victory. You paraded your ex-lover into my house, into my family. You thought I would stay silent forever." Clara shook her head frantically, tears streaking her cheeks. Adrian shifted back a step, his arrogance gone, his composure cracking. But Brandon didn't falter. He had shown the truth in front of everyone who mattered. Families, neighbors, the very community Clara had wanted to impress. The sanctuary that should have witnessed blessing now stood as witness to betrayal. The baptism was no longer a celebration. It was the unveiling of deception, and Clara Parker was at its center. The sanctuary was still buzzing with whispers, the echoes of Clara's shame bouncing off the stone walls. The screen behind the altar faded to black, leaving only silence and the weight of what everyone had just seen. Clara clutched the baby tighter, her face pale, streaked with tears. Adrian Blake stood frozen a few feet away, his once smug expression reduced to a mask of unease. Brandon Parker remained at the front, calm as stone, his black suit catching the muted glow of the stained glass. He let the silence stretch, let the congregation's unease grow until every eye was fixed on him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, and undeniable. "I know what some of you are thinking," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "That maybe pictures and videos don't tell the full story. That maybe this could be explained away as friendship, coincidence, or harmless mistakes." A murmur rippled through the pews. Clara's lips trembled as she tried to form words, but nothing came out. Brandon reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. Its weight seemed heavier than paper, heavier than ink. It was truth, sharpened into a blade. He held it up so the congregation could see. This, he continued, is the result of a DNA test I ordered days after returning home. It is official, it is certified, and it is final. He walked to the pastor, placing the envelope firmly in his hand. The pastor hesitated, looking at Brandon with wide eyes. Brandon nodded once. "Read it." The pastor's fingers trembled as he broke the seal and unfolded the crisp white sheet. His lips moved over the words before he spoke them aloud, his voice echoing in the hushed sanctuary. DNA test report. Probability of paternity, 0%. The congregation erupted. Gasps, whispers, cries, some in disbelief, some in pity. A woman in the back clasped her chest. Clara let out a strangled sob, nearly collapsing onto the pew behind her. Adrian's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. Brandon's expression didn't change. He stood tall, hands clasped before him, his gaze locked on Clara. The room's noise washed over him, but he didn't flinch. The pastor lowered the paper, his eyes heavy with sorrow as he glanced between Brandon, Clara, and Adrian. The truth was no longer rumor. It was written, official, undeniable. Clara stumbled forward, her voice cracking. "Brandon, please, don't do this here. We can talk, we can fix—" But her pleas drowned in the murmurs of the guests. Neighbors shook their heads. Relatives whispered to one another, shame etched across their faces. Adrian tried to step closer, but the weight of the congregation's eyes pinned him in place. Brandon finally moved, stepping toward Clara with slow precision. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the sanctuary, each word sharp enough to cut. "You named another man as godfather to a child that isn't mine. You gave that child his name. You tried to bury me under your betrayal, to parade your ex-lover in front of our families. But the truth has a way of finding the light." Clara's tears flowed freely now, her arms tightening around the infant. "I made a mistake, Brandon. Please, don't humiliate me like this." Brandon's jaw clenched, his eyes cold. "Humiliation isn't what I've done. It's what you've done. To me, to this family, to yourself. I only pulled back the curtain." The whispers rose louder, the sting of betrayal sinking deep into every guest present. Clara's mother covered her face, unable to watch. Adrian's relatives shifted uncomfortably, their heads lowered in shame. The sanctuary was no longer a place of blessing. It had become a courtroom of truth, and Clara was already condemned. Brandon turned once more to the crowd, his voice steady. "Now you all know the truth. This child is not mine, and this marriage—" He paused, his gaze returning to Clara, "is over." The room froze, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Clara's knees buckled, and Adrian stepped toward her instinctively, though his presence now carried no pride, only exposure. The church was silent now, except for Clara's muffled sobs. She clutched the baby as though the child could shield her from the truth hanging heavy in the air. Adrian stood near the altar, his face tight, his usual arrogance replaced by a thin layer of panic. The congregation shifted uneasily in their seats, unsure whether to rise, to leave, or to watch what they all sensed was not yet finished. Brandon Parker moved with the steadiness of a man who had already accepted the outcome. His shoes struck the stone floor with measured weight as he walked back to his briefcase resting on the pew. He opened it, reached inside, and pulled out a thick envelope. He held it in his hand a moment, letting the congregation see it before he turned back toward Clara. Her tear-streaked face lifted, her eyes wide, already begging. "Brandon, please, don't do this here." He approached slowly, his presence filling the space between them. His voice was steady, cold, and final. "You thought this day was yours. You thought you could spit on my name, parade your ex-lover in front of me, and etch his name into the legacy of a child who is not mine. You thought silence meant weakness." Clara's head shook violently, her arms tightening around the infant. "I was wrong. I didn't mean—" Brandon didn't let her finish. He extended the envelope toward her, his hand unshaking. "These are divorce papers, signed, filed, waiting for your acknowledgement. You and I are over, Clara. The congregation gasped again, though softer this time. It wasn't shock anymore. It was inevitability. The whispers started almost immediately. Divorce. He filed. It's over. Clara's trembling fingers reached for the envelope but stopped short, as though touching it would make the separation real. You can't mean this. Please don't end everything like this. Brandon's gaze cut into her, his voice calm but merciless. End everything? You ended it the moment you called Adrian instead of me. You ended it when you get impregnated by him. You ended it when you turned our marriage into a stage for your betrayal. This is not my ending, Clara. This is yours. Clara sobbed harder, collapsing onto the front pew, the baby wailing in her arms. The pristine image she had tried to build, the glowing wife, the proud mother, the woman in control, lay shattered in front of every family member, every neighbor, every friend. Brandon turned once more to the crowd, his voice carrying across the sanctuary with finality. This marriage is dissolved. This child is not mine. Let the truth be remembered, not the lies. He slid the papers into Clara's lap. She clutched them with trembling fingers, as if holding them might somehow undo what had been done. But the ink was real, the filing was real, and the finality was real. Brandon straightened his suit jacket, turned on his heel, and walked down the aisle. The doors at the end of the church swung open, sunlight streaming in as he stepped outside. A sleek black limousine waited at the curb, 2 bodyguards posted beside it. He entered without looking back. Inside the church, the silence was suffocating. Clara remained crumpled on the pew, her dress wrinkled, her face streaked with tears, clutching the infant and the envelope that sealed her ruin. Adrian stood beside her, exposed and powerless. The day she had hoped would elevate her had instead buried her. The baptism that should have been her triumph had become the public execution of her pride. And Brandon Parker, the man she thought she had silenced, walked away not broken, but victorious, leaving behind nothing but shame, whispers, and a future she could no longer control. Do you think Brandon was right to expose her openly? Do you think she deserves another chance? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting and true-to-life stories.